this wasn't going to be a neutral view, that I wasn't going to be teaching a neutral view of history. And I wanted them to know that, all right? And they had to feel, and sometimes that brought about emotions with students. It was emotional for them to learn things they never learned from a different perspective. And sometimes it was, you know, it's sad to say, I don't necessarily have the words, maybe they felt a little shame, and we had to get over that. And we had not over the shame, but understand what it was about and why that was there. And so the emotional, that emotional sense, we had to create a classroom where we could talk about it. And that's where, I'm telling you, the students want to learn. They want to have a culturally responsive education. They want to. Teachers want to teach it. I believe they feel that they don't have the resources or the background or the teaching themselves, and that's where we have to help. So open, honest, inclusive means, you know, just to be funny in a way, add a little humor, they'd say, okay, what are you going to ruin for us next? Okay, because we had that relationship, you know, just thinking of the story of, let's say, a Pocahontas, that, no, it's not a Barbie doll, okay? Or the story of Thanksgiving. No, it's not the first Thanksgiving, okay? You know, what do we know about what really happened? But they really wanted to learn about it. And I think you have to do that. You have to be open and honest. And there's a saying that I stole from Johanna Hayes when she became our teacher of the year here in Connecticut. And she always said this, and I believe it wholeheartedly: students don't care what you know until they know that you care. So that's step number one in having an open, honest in teaching.
Yeah, thank you. And I just appreciate the reminder that, again, it's about content, but it's not just about content. There's many, many other things that are.
And don't forget our cultures. Don't forget our stories. And that's really hard for non-native people. And I understand that, to tell other stories. That's why I always like to say, learn a little, you know, before you tell someone's story, learn a little about it. Learn a little bit about it.
Okay, thank you. Alex, I think you have one more question for Beth. We go on to Professor Grande.
Yeah, well, first of all, I wish I had been able to take your class. It just, the way you speak,
I wish I had you.
Phenomenal. But you've also spoken about the importance of getting students out of the classroom as being really important to their educational experiences, particularly when learning Native American history. So can you kind of talk about the ways in which you do that?
That's a great question. And I tie it to my culture as well. You know, Native Americans, as we know, everyone isn't identical, tribes, Native people, and we teach that. But we might have some common belief systems once in a while, you know. One is a reverence for the land. So sometimes our space, our place, our stories, okay, are here, our memories are here. And so one of the things I like to do is get students outside to experience that when we're telling a story, because stories are more than just listening. It's observing. It's remembering, it's sharing, it's a lesson. So sometimes we'll go outside, but I also like to bring them to our reservations. I like to bring students to places to visit. I brought them to, I'm fortunate, excuse me, to have a vibrant culture here at Mohegan, where I could bring students to our sweat lodge and let them see and experience in a unique way. You can teach what a ceremony is, and from a book or from a PowerPoint, it's not the same, even though there might be great sources, but you'll never forget it when you're there. So I think it's important to get people out, taking students to Pine Ridge for work vacations, okay, taking them to our reservation, to museums, even though we're not just in the past, okay, to places, and bringing others in. So I think it's so important. No math lesson, no science lesson can trump it, okay? There's nothing like learning, and that's the thing I used to have to try to express to my colleagues. Learning takes place outside of the classroom. Let us do that. So thank you, Alex. That's a fabulous question.
Oh, thank you so much for all of your comments. Like, we're really learning so much from you. Next, we're gonna get to talk to Professor Sandy Grande, who's gonna help us give a big picture overview. So let's welcome Sandy.
Great.
Oh, thanks so much, Alex and Dan. And just want to thank the Anti-Racist Teaching Learning Collective and Yale for hosting us. Ayanchu Sweetie Sandy Grande, I identify as a Quechua National. I just want to, before I go through my points, want to say we also had a conversation about who we should foreground. And I'm so glad we moved, Beth, to have you first, both as somebody of the territories in which we currently occupy, as an elder among us, and clearly as a master teacher. So thank you so much. I learned so much from, and I just appreciate all the work that you've done. I'm just going to make 4 quick points. Again, sort of, I think it's important to kind of cede the time to the folks, because one thing about Native Studies, as Beth was saying, it's very context and location and land specific, people specific. So I think that's important. So I'll just make 4 kind of overarching points for teachers and students and folks thinking about entering into the space of teaching Native Studies. And the first thing I would say is to understand that Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, are citizens of different nations. So Beth mentioned several times, there's lots of different people. I think currently there's like 574 federally recognized tribes. And then what that even means is it's a whole nother lesson. But when you think of nations, typically you think of, spaces external to the US, and these are internal. In the kind of governance documents, there's reference to Indigenous nations as domestic dependent nations, again, not unproblematically, but they have distinctive, clearly languages, cultures, but even laws and policies, and certainly treaties that govern their relationship to what we now call the United States. And so understand that while Native peoples are racialized, they are distinct from other racialized peoples and ethnic groups within the US. And I see confusion around that all the time. But mostly to try to give as an example, and by I mean confusion, if as internal nations and sovereign nations within, again, what we call the United States, the struggle of Indigenous peoples historically and currently is really about recognition of that national sovereignty, and really not, and it's often, as opposed to that, cast alongside other racialized groups as the struggle being about inclusion and enfranchisement. So clearly in election cycles, I'll use that as an example because we're just coming off that. When people are advocating, I think well-minded, well-intended people advocating or thinking that they're advocating for Native peoples, they're like, yeah, Native peoples didn't even get the right to vote until 1942, I think it was. And it's true, that's the moment in which Native peoples were ostensibly enfranchised, but from many people's perspective, that was an imposition. It wasn't a right that was celebrated, because at the same time it enfranchised them with respect to US governance, it also was a non-recognition or even an erosion of their Indigenous sovereignty. So again, if there's, like, the first point is understanding what it means to be a Native person within the US and a citizen of their own nations. And not, again, while racialized, not the same as other racial and ethnic groups. The second is also something Beth mentioned, and that's the relationship to the land. And I would agree, even globally, that land is the relation that's sort of the irreducible element of Indigenous identity. And it's also the central desire of colonialism, of settler colonialism specifically. And this is true, I would say, even in instances which we have somewhat in Connecticut, even when there's peoples that don't have land as a material kind of thing. Because in addition to just land itself, and people are often get, I don't know, anxious when Indigenous peoples talk about wanting land back. Land back is a current sort of contemporary movement among Indigenous peoples. In addition to that, I mean, land back is absolutely the ask and one of the forefronts of struggle, but land is also a relation. And what I mean by that is it's through land and our relationship to land and water and all our other other than human kin. That's how we learn how to be human, is how we live, I guess. I was going to say a lot. I mean, in many ways, as Beth was also saying, language is important, and in many ways, English fails to kind of capture what meanings really are to Indigenous peoples within their own cultural spheres. So it's often reduced I hear it reduced as sort of a spiritual connection. And while that's there, it's much more than that. And maybe the best word to capture it is something akin to the notion of relation. And you have a very specific relationship to whatever is your homeland. So there's a very specific way to live in balance or harmony, maybe that's a good word, in the Andes, and it's different if you're a Great Lakes tribal nation or if you're an oceanic peoples. How you live, how you be human is very much located to a particular place. The third thing that I would say is, because land is so important and kind of how you relate to, I mean, certainly peoples and peoples in your community, but also other than human kin in your, in and around your community. There's a scholar by the name of Glenn Couthard who wrote a book called Red Skins, White Masks that I highly recommend. But he, a central part of that text is, I guess, a saying of sorts that says, for Indigenous peoples to live, capitalism must die. And that usually takes teachers' breath away because, you know, I mean, capitalism gets much more questioned now than it used to. But it's very much a part of modernist society. And again, in that sense, capitalism as an economic system is something that many Indigenous peoples challenge. But beyond an economic system, capitalism is also a particular kind of social relation that conditions other social relations for all of us. And by that, I think, to put it simply, I guess, is how the market system, market logics, shape everything, including social relations. And in market logics, I would include things like competition, individualism, transactionalism, accumulation, extraction. And if we think about how those values also shape schooling practices, you know, I'm happy to talk about that, but you can probably think for yourself, in what way do schooling practices or relations of teaching and learning reflect values of competition, individualism, achievement, extraction, transactionalism, etc. And the fourth and last point, which is something that Dan also mentioned, is beyond content. We often focus quite a bit on getting the right books and getting culturally responsive or, you know, reflective materials. That's important. Certainly representation is important, and how Native peoples are represented in all kinds of curriculum materials. But pedagogy is also important. And I'll use maybe one quick example. I know that teaching in Connecticut continues to be, I think, the kind of way curriculum is organized is still by understanding by design, which is kind of oriented around essential questions. So it really is about what kinds of questions you ask of the material that you have, regardless of what it is. And I'll share a story of I had a student teacher that was struggling with this sort of idea of how can you teach in a, maybe, let's say, in a decolonial way, if you have a specific content that's scripted. And we started asking about questions. So we reduced it down to a really simple content to kind of just focus on the question. And so I said, what is it that, let's pick something really simple that we could teach a lesson around. And for whatever reason, the student said rice. And I said, okay. In terms of like, what some of you might understand, but we can, you know, talk more in the Q&A about like a banking model of teaching. The question you might ask is, what is rice, right? And you would, you know, learn the different properties, maybe what it needs to grow, and, you know, maybe where it sits in the food pyramid or something like that. In a multicultural pedagogical model, you might learn that there's multiple kinds of rice. Every culture has some form of rice, and, you know, you could have a feast or something of multicultural rice. In a social justice oriented curriculum, you might ask the question, who has rice? So you get to issues of access and equity. Why is, you know, is there abundance of rice over here? What's the, what if we go to the market, how much it's going to cost over here versus over there, and you get into questions of equity and access. In a decolonial model, you might ask, what is the life of rice? What kinds of relationships does rice unto itself need to grow and be a healthy crop? So you begin with the vantage point. I think that's something Beth and Dan also remembered, from the perspective of rice itself as it's having its own life and value outside of human consumption. So all that is to say, again, in addition to content, you really have to think about pedagogy. And in this instance, I'm talking about pedagogy in terms of the kinds of questions we ask. And then a bigger question in terms of all of schooling. If there's one question we could ask that might, or I think would dramatically reframe how we think about schooling, how we think about teaching and learning, is what if the only measure of how a student is achieving, or the only measure of achievement, I guess, is whether or not the young person was learning how to be a good relative. And I mean that, again, in multiple senses of that word, relative or relation, both in terms of their interpersonal, how are they able to cultivate and manage and navigate interpersonal relationships, which can be challenging, and that's definitely a skill to learn. How do they negotiate, their own relationship to the world, to broader questions, and to their environment, which includes, again, other than human beings. If we centered that in everything that we did in schools, I think schooling would look fundamentally different in good ways. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Grande. I mean, there's just so much there. But I feel like just one thing that I really learned and took is like how expansive teaching with Indigenous studies is, how it cuts, what is in our curriculum now as science, as technology, as ecology. It raises fundamental questions about all these areas, the division of knowledge. And in that sense, thinking about it simply as a subject actually is quite limited in that way. So we're just grateful for that, and look forward in the Q&A to also hearing about some of your experiences as a teacher educator in helping to engage students in this. So I think, Alex, we're ready. We just one fantastic speaker after another. So we want to welcome Shaquana and Philip. And I'm going to turn it over to you, and just welcome folks who have just joined us, and invite you to start sharing your questions in the chat for our speakers in a moment. So go ahead, Alex.
Yes, welcome, Shaquana and Philip. Thank you so much for being here. Both of you serve as members of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation Youth Council. And I was just wondering if you guys could talk about the work that the Youth Council does and some of the issues that you address.
Go ahead, Shaq, you can go first.
Okay. So I'm Shaquana Sebastian. I am the former chairwoman of Youth Council. I recently just transitioned to advisor, and Philip is now the chairman, and he's very great. So basically the Youth Council serves 14 to 24-year-olds on the reservation. We also just serve the community as a whole, but we mostly aim towards the 14 to 24-year-olds. We cater to the needs of our community, and we find solutions to make things better. We host events, to bring the community together. And then we also, whether it be internal or external, so like we've partnered with Nike and brought, things for the youth so they can build team building, or we do like we had some opioid trainings to combat the opioid crisis in Indian country. We've done voter registrations, pretty much anything that we can do, we do. We address anything that happens, or, anything that we could prevent from happening with our youth as well, whether it be trainings or any informational things that they may need, helping them, get in direct contact with departments within the reservation, or education as well. And that's pretty much all I have. So if Phil wants to take, I don't want to say everything.
Yeah, Shaq. I agree a lot with the things that Shaq was saying. We acknowledge that as a youth council, our greatest asset, natural resource, whatever you want to call it, is our people. So we strive to help our people, no matter whether it be. We are called a youth council, but we try to help. We meet with our elders probably once a month. We meet with our tribal council, and sometimes a lot of our views are taking things off of their plates because obviously they're older, they're more experienced, they're more knowledgeable than we have. They've been around the block. So we take a lot of the community-based things that they either can't do or have great ideas for that maybe we should be better off doing. And we take them and we run with that. One example is we actually recently just helped out with our talent show. We have a talent show every year. We usually have it at the casino, but obviously as times are troubling now with COVID and stuff, it was our first ever virtual one, and it was a great success. We've helped out with that. We do a lot of things, basically just bouncing off of our youth and what they want. Anything that a public servant tries to do, we try to help with. It's voluntary. We just promote the development of our future leaders. We try to do that every day. So that's about it.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, the work that you do is so important. Kind of turning it a little bit, as students, how would you assess how the curriculum and education you received addressed Native American history and contemporary Native issues? And what was missing and what more needs to be done in your opinion?
Overall, I think that they taught the absolute wrong things. Going into when I knew, like in our history class, like when I knew that this subject was coming up, like the topic was coming up, I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. Like I've known this, like, like this is what we're taught. We live on the reservation. Like this is going to be super easy. And it was nothing like like what we were taught, what we know, like this is what we live, or what our ancestors went through. So you would think, and it was the complete opposite, and I was just like a little taken aback, but I was still young, so I was just like, okay, like I'm not sure like what's going on. I remember going to my teacher and asking, like, I'm just so confused, like I'm like, how is this happening? Like I was like, you have a reservation, like 5 minutes down the road from you. Majority of the kids from the reservation, attend this school. Like, why is, the information false? So, pretty much false. And I think from, if they would want to teach the right things, I think going to the actual source and actually maybe having a connection with local tribes and, learning from them and getting the education and teaching it, from our point of view would be best. And, because then it also like makes you seem like you don't fit in, like, you know what I'm saying? Like you get taught and they're teaching one thing, but you were taught, and grown up a different way. So they look at you like, so what's the truth? And so I think and it definitely caused a little battle because I had spoke about this before, you choose like what you want to do. Like you're trying to conform to this new world while still being, intact with your community, your culture. So it's a lot. And I think that, from here on out, if they're willing to make the change and, everyone is helping us push towards, having this taught in the curriculum, I think it should be taught the right way and from the direct sources.
Yeah, agreed. And Shaq took the high road, so she leaves me no choice. But frankly speaking, Ledyard Public Schools failed us. They fail us today. They failed us 20 years before that, 40 years before that. Ledyard has been next to Mashantucket for, I don't know, probably like something above 140 years now. They are very familiar with us. And just throughout history, there has been repetitive examples of just frustration, and what it really is trauma that you see coming out in our kids. And it's just hard to, when you send all your kids to one place, it's hard to respect them back when you can tell blatantly that they have no respect for you or your people. Like, it was literally, I don't think I've ever heard Mashantucket, the words Mashantucket or Pequot in a history class, social studies class, you name it, in my entire career. I went to Ledyard, Gallup Hill, Ledyard Middle, Ledyard High School. I don't think I've ever heard the words, frankly. And like, I like to think I come from a good home, so I get my teachings at home. So it was never really too much of an issue for me. But my dad and my mom couldn't make up for the identity issues that I was having, and that Shaquana was having, and that all of our people are having. Our community can't make up for these issues because, like, we feel it. It's real. And you guys see me and Shaquana right now. Like, me and Shaquana don't look like cousins. And that's just how we are, where we're at in life. It's 2021. There's so much intermarrying, interchanging and stuff. People going places and stuff like that. We look like we're from all over, and people, I don't know, it seems to really just bother people. And that has followed suit in our education from day one.
I just both so appreciate, you know, on both sides, you know, like, just to take this in, but both you describing the roles that you play as educators. I mean, that's personally first what you kind of talked about, like the education is already happening, and then just the profound and violent ways that your description of the current schools. And so I just, as before we turn to the next part of the panel, could you talk a little bit about, you know, for teachers, educators listening in, the advice and direction and counsel you have, especially for folks new to teaching in these areas and teaching about Native studies? What direction would you give them?
Yeah, so along with what Beth was saying, I think the most important, like, advice that I could give to teachers is honestly just educate themselves on trauma and trauma informed environments. I mean, that just seems like, to me, it is just, well, no matter how you deal about it, it's number one. Because if you don't learn how to teach these kids who are affected by it, and teach kids who aren't how to recognize it, there's no way that so many different parties can just sit in the same room and all learn together the truths or the lies that we have to relearn. That is also another very important thing with new teachers, is unlearning a lot of the things that we learn in our history, in our public schools. No matter what state you are, you have to unlearn so many things. It is just like, it's inconvenient. And you know what they say, you don't know what you don't know. It's hard when you're a kid to go through school and know whether or not your teacher is dragging the truth, or just not really telling you the whole story, or what you may. But I think that would definitely be my number one, is trauma informed environments. Another thing too would be learning about Indigenous people all year long. Because, like, I don't want a month, I don't want a day. My history has been aligned with yours since day one, and you've only taught your side. That's basically what we're getting at here. You haven't taught my side, and that's just that's what it is.
I agree with Philip as well. And I would just say, you know, especially becoming a teacher and you want to teach, you know, this about our heritage, our culture, our history. I think, you know, a part of doing that is also help break that intergenerational trauma. So, you know, become aware, become involved, and just pretty much learn, as Beth was saying, learn outside, learn hands-on, and be able to just, you know, go to your local, you know, learn from, you know, your local tribes, and just be able to, you know, help break that intergenerational trauma, and make a better pathway in the future for our, you know, youth, because that's what youth council is all about, is for the youth. And, you know, breaking that trauma, and hoping that they progress in life and they don't have to choose or conform between who they want to be. They can just proudly be themselves. So I
Yeah,
think
and to add on to that too, another thing that I forgot to add into my last question. And I want to say it was what, last March? Yeah, March of 2020. I was asked to speak on behalf of the tribe. This was when I was treasurer of the youth council. And I was asked, my dad, Michael Thomas, was asked. We had Vice Chairwoman Clough was asked to speak. And then who else spoke on our behalf? Oh, and then Senator Kathy Austin. For a Senate bill, Senate Bill 314, that was speaking. It was basically just on the inclusion of Native American studies into social studies and making it mandatory for public schools in Connecticut to teach Native American studies, which is just, I mean, that's crazy to me. I'm 23 years old. We're in the year 2021, and we are now making it mandatory to teach Native education in schools. It seems unreal to me, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm definitely appreciative of it, and I'm appreciative that they asked me to speak and that they allowed me to speak. We also spoke on, obviously, the House bill version of it, House Bill 6619. That one we spoke. It was probably, actually, yeah, it was a few weeks ago. So now we're just waiting on the people from the state to decide. They're looking over things. They're saying that it looks good. They're just changing up language as we speak. So we're really excited for that. They actually, the tribe over here actually just asked me and Shaquana to be on our social justice committee, which was a newly created committee in 2020. They saw some of the things that we were doing with Youth Council, speaking on behalf of ourselves and as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement that we all saw last year in 2020 and stuff. And we really just tried to like get out and help, because obviously, as we know, we're talking about Indigenous studies here, but me and Shaquana are also of other ethnicities and other backgrounds and stuff. So as we all are, we're all mixed with a bunch of stuff. So one thing that we're really excited to see come to fruition is this bill. So prayers that they pass it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you guys so much. I mean, for sharing everything. And it just reminds me about, the power of youth and how it's so exciting, the futures that we'll all create. But yeah, again, thank you so much. We're going to welcome endawnis Spears next to ask a few questions. And we're excited to have her. Hello. Hi. So, welcome. The Akomawt Educational Initiative, which you are a part of, has a long record of working with both K through 12 educators and museum staff and professionals around Native American studies, teaching concepts and literacies. Can you talk about some of the basic concepts you try to instill in your workshops and conversations with people new to these fields?
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Danielle, and all of the folks, Natalia and Nassim, for having us this evening, and so many thanks to my fellow panelists for saying so much better than anything that I could say. So I just kind of get to say a lot of ditto to some of the thoughts that were shared here this evening. I think one of the key concepts that Sandy was talking about earlier tonight is being modeled in this panel. We just have such a stellar group here in terms of representation from various generations, right? So we have veteran teachers who are culture bearers, who have been in their community and doing that work of culture and education, and also kind of outward facing work in the form of the incredible work that Beth has done and continues to do, and Sandy as well. And then our young people here providing their perspective. I think one of the things that Akomawt is always advocating for, but is being modeled here, is that knowledge is spread out across generations, right? Knowledge is spread out across genders. Knowledge is spread out across all of these different roles and places in the kinship model that Sandy was talking about. So we have to acknowledge that as kind of one of the transformative parts of kind of recognizing this other forms of pedagogy that Sandy and Beth were both speaking to. And so I think that that's one of the key concepts, that if you have one voice kind of inundating or dominating the narrative, then you're doing it wrong. So you have to have other genders, male, female, and all the genders in between, our two-spirit relatives, kind of all of that knowledge incorporated and folded into the curriculum at every opportunity. And I think that that's being modeled here this evening, and I'm so humbled to be a part of it. I think some of the things that Philip and Shaquana were talking about in terms of the specificity of the terminology that you are using. Native American as a term is a catch-all phrase that is in the English language, so it's a failure outright at the beginning. But also it's referring to an incredibly diverse constellation of cultures and languages, cosmologies, epistemologies. And so kind of to use the term Native American is reductive. And there are so many opportunities to be incredibly specific. If you are teaching about Connecticut, you're teaching about a specific place. All of the other panelists referred to this already, that we are talking of people who have ties to a specific sacred geography. And so we can use the names of those people. We can say their names in our classrooms. We can kind of call that presence and that accountability to a living group of people into our terminology. Native American, you have no relationship with that. You kind of evoke this kind of idea of someone who lived a long time ago, or someone who's caught up in the masketry or the kind of icons of indigeneity that are introduced in classrooms and reified in pop culture. And so instead, you have an obligation to say, if you are a teacher in Ledyard, Connecticut, to say Mashantucket Pequot, or to say Eastern Pequot, or to say the Pequot people when you are teaching about a specific place. And the opportunities are there. And we encourage our educators in the classroom and in public history spaces to take that opportunity to use those very specific terms. And we already, the panelists talked about this also. To get comfortable using these terms because they are not often kind of at the forefront of the way that people engage with Native histories and contemporary tribal nations. So I think kind of thinking critically about the terminology we use, being specific, having that pedagogical input, that humility to understand that you as the educator will need to lean on other perspectives to create a full understanding of any subject, including Native people. And so I think that those are some of kind of the key things that we try to discuss or give opportunity for teachers to engage in.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, so many important things there. And in addition, among many educational issues that AEI engages in is the continued use of Native mascots in K through 12 schools, colleges, and universities, and in professional sports. Can you talk to us kind of about the importance of this issue for K through 12 educators specifically, and how recent debates about the use of these images in Connecticut have unfolded?
Yeah, I'm not gonna channel my inner Chris Newell here, but I'm gonna do my best to kind of speak to some of the perspectives that are really important when it comes to talking about the link between the use of Native people and Indigenous people as mascots in the form of masketry, and the constant erasure in curriculum that is happening, that there is a very distinct kind of line between the two, and that at play are some really important kind of approaches to that classroom educators have to understand if they're going to kind of make long-term investments in their community that may not yield change in this generation. And so when we're talking about shifting over in the use of mascots, in which there are plenty in Connecticut, and there are plenty across New England, hovering around. I mean, a few years ago, we had almost 100 different schools with Native people as mascots. And the curriculum that was taught in those schools, of course, was non-existent outside of, as Philip and Shaquana talked about, outside of Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving and kind of masketry utilize Native people as props in a larger narrative that is more important for the dominant kind of culture than it is for Native people. And so Native people are going to buy products, kind of standing by and watching what is happening around them, but are not cast or given the agency to really take up that kind of work to make those changes in the classroom. So I think there's a direct line there. And we have incredible advocates in the community. So if we're talking about, the anti-racist teaching and learning collective, the Mashantucket Pequot Youth Council has spoken on these issues in the past. Our professors and classroom educators and professors at UConn and at Yale, and our students, there's a community of co-conspirators who are doing this work in different places. And we want to acknowledge that that is a really important part of making these long-term changes. And classroom educators can be a part of that ecosystem of change in your own classrooms in the curricular approaches that were talked about here this evening. But just know that you are not standing on an island alone, that there is this thriving kind of community of support that brings their own form of knowledge and their own perspectives into these spaces in solidarity with one another. Everyone from, I'm looking at all of these wonderful friends here on this call tonight, from People Get Ready books and people working in the Library of Congress. There is this vast network that we can tap into and feed one another what we need intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. I think that Beth and Sandy both talked about the heart work that has to be done in tandem with the pedagogical kind of intellectual work. And we recognize that as a really important part of the work that we are all doing, is that it requires some kind of literacy in the soul. And that is a really important part, I believe, and Akomawt believes in the work that we're all talking about tonight.
Thanks so much, and that was for that just a really incredible distillation of both everything we've heard tonight and that kind of invitation for people to imagine themselves as not being stuck in the place that we're at. And I'll just also say that, AEI, is this tremendous resource, and the districts, administrators, states can turn to, can contract with, can take direction from. So there's resources here for people to make use of, and the information is in the chat. So thank you. We have about 10 minutes left now for questions. So I want to invite all the panelists to kind of come back and turn it over to our colleague, Natalia Brzezinski, a teacher at Metro High School Business Academy in New Haven, who's been keeping an eye on the chat. And I think, Natalia, you have some questions that you're going to invite the panelists to engage.
Yes, this has been so powerful and beautiful. Thank you to all the panelists. Our first question is, how did you begin the process of developing your course and getting it approved?
Excellent question. It was a long process. It took several years. Part of it was becoming very fatigued with teaching the traditional American histories, and it just was so frustrating. And so I approached my administration and offered to start an elective, and at least got a lot of support. And then I reached out to my tribe. So I brought together my community, our resources, and I did a lot of work and research, because it's a myth that Native people and Indigenous people know all their history or know their culture that much. And so I had to do a lot of work myself. So I called on others to help me, and I did get a lot of help. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but we learned, some of it was learning together. So approaching people with the desire to do the work is what helped. And I said I would do it, and they allowed me to do it. So that's what I would say, to reach out to your communities. I was grateful from the help that I got from my community and others as well.
Yes.
including Mashantucket representatives here. Working with the Mashantuckets as well.
Yeah, such a great reminder that none of us have to do this work alone, and in fact, we shouldn't. The next question is, let's see, if each speaker, it'd be great to hear from everyone, had a book, a text of some sort that you'd recommend, whether it's a novel or something, you know, a pedagogical book, something that you'd recommend. And you can also, you know, marinate on it if you need a minute with this one.
I don't need to marinate, because when Philip, I'm fully marinated. So as Philip and Chickasaw were speaking, I really want, and I don't know if this is on the resource list, Indigenous Children's Survivance in Public Schools by Leilani Sabzalian. It might be on the resource list already, but this is such an incredible resource for trauma-informed educators. And so I really highly recommend it. And I'm so humbled and honored to be in the same Zoom room as Shafana and Philip.
Thank you. Other folks, you've got one?
I would recommend, first of all, that sounds wonderful, that book. Thank you. It really does, because I think people need to imagine the Indigenous Native students sitting in their classroom. You need to be able to empathize there. I would choose one, that's called Medicine Trail, The Life and Lessons of Gladys Tentaquidgeon, and it infuses the history of a woman who stood for social justice, Gladys Tentaquidgeon, who lived to 105 years old as a Mohegan medicine woman and a woman of social justice. And what this does is it tells the narrative not only of her life and her life trail, but also it infuses the oral tradition, which people forget that is so much a part of who we are. And so I would recommend Medicine Trail, The Life and Lessons of Gladys Tentaquidgeon, especially for Connecticut local people.
I'm so happy to hear that. I recently did an assignment with my students where they wrote a speech about what should replace the Christopher Columbus statue. And after doing some research, and it was pretty open, one of my students chose Gladys. So I love that. Other folks want to share a book, a text?
I'll go quickly. So one would be Our History is the Future by Nick Estes, which is a history book, but I think what he models beautifully in that text is how, we're really talking about a history of the present or the colonial present. So he does he begins with, he's a Lakota, and he begins with the prayer camps or the kind of land offenders at Standing Rock, and then talks about, that movement, the history of that movement, and then sort of moving forward, how it continues to impact their lives today. And then a book of poetry, actually, by Layli Long Soldier, who's a beautiful poet and writer, which kind of models a very different way of learning about and Native life. And she was just recognized with another award today. So it's really probably one of the most beautiful books of poetry that I've ever read.
Thank you. Philip?
Okay, my first suggestion is one that I actually just started reading a little bit ago, and I don't have it because it's upstairs, but I'll show a picture. If you can see it, it's this is what the cover looks like, but it's called Rebuilding Native Nations, Strategies for Governance and Development. And it was recommended to me by my dad. I've only read like the first few chapters so far, but it basically just goes, oh wow, see.
Yeah, you got it.
Good book. Yeah, see, I just started it, but I love it. And I love it so far, at least. Yeah. And I would definitely recommend that one. Another one I would recommend, which is a book by a Pequot. If you read On Our Own Ground by William Apes, it's literally just a story of a Pequot man. So if you're interested, check it out.
Thank you. I bet People Get Ready has a lot of these books. So get ready. And anyone else would like to share? All right. Another question for the group is about globalization and thinking about indigeneity from a transnational context. The question is, do the speakers have insight into how Indigenous groups are racialized outside of the US or North American context? Anybody interested in speaking to that question?
I can go and be relatively brief. So, I mean, yeah, it depends on what Indigenous, and even how the signifier of Indigenous travels globally. So there's Indigenous peoples to the continent of Africa, there's Indigenous peoples in the South America, obviously there's Indigenous people in New Zealand. So, once it travels outside the US, and it has the notion of Indigenous specifically actually has its own history in the US, back to the late 18th, early 19th century, grounded in struggle. I don't know that comes to us first, but of that era of peoples, William Yates actually also kind of what's the movement in which we together could kind of stave the encroachment of settler colonialism. But it travels in really different ways, but I would say some of the issues around dispossession, particularly land dispossession, fighting mining companies. I mean, there's like 4 global corporations that kind of impact all of our lives pretty much when it comes to water, mineral extraction, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's another way, that's a different way to sort of organize how we think about indigeneity globally.
Thank you. And I think we probably have time just for one question. This is actually my question. I was really struck by all of you brought up in some different way, emotion or affect or trauma, these things that get, so left out of pedagogy. They're considered like separate from it when actually they're, I believe they're so central to it. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about like value of bringing those things, our emotions, our whole selves into the classroom as teachers and learners. And would love to hear from the young people as well, especially for this.
I'll go. So I personally always speak from emotion just because I live through it. And I just think it's better to just be real and open, just so people, they would be able to understand from my point of view and also feel like where I'm coming from. Because, it's just, I don't know, I just think like growing up and just like as Philip had said before about us being from having different backgrounds and stuff, like I'm also African American as well. So, just growing up and the struggles that I had went through, I think it's best to just be able to speak, from your heart and just tell the truth, just so like they will understand. Because I think it's better that way instead of sugarcoating and not telling the full truth. And it's just better because people will understand, and then that will hopefully change their point of view or their opinions that they have, and be willing to open up more and also make a change in their lives to learn.
Thank you.
Can you repeat that question for me too one more time?
Yeah, the question, I mean, Philip, you specifically said that trauma informed was, education was so important to you, and other folks spoke about like affect or emotion, and those things are kind of often taught as outside of the classroom, like they don't belong there. And I think we all disagree. And I just wondered if you could speak more about the importance of like emotion in the classroom as a teacher or as a learner or both.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, part of what I was saying before about like why it's important goes back to what endawnis and Beth were also touching on, is the fact that we're still here and living today. Like it would be one thing, and that's a big thing that they try to do, is they'll try to museumize like us and like almost act like if like we're good. It's like what they do to Martin Luther King and like Rosa Parks. Like they put them like in a museum and they're like, oh, they did great things and this and that. But like, if you were to really look at how people were treating them, how the world was treating them at the time of their stances and what they were doing for their communities and their people did not like them. Like, don't try to do that. And it's because they're authentic and they're real and they give off something that you can't really replicate unless you really live that and you really have that feeling. So like us growing up in Mashantucket, it's not really hard for me to get up here and talk about the indecencies or the things that I go through, because I mean, realistically, we're born here with trauma, and that's not even, I'm not singling us out. Like that's everybody. A lot of people in this world are coming to this world with trauma, and it's really about how much we can scale it back, and how much we can teach ourselves to live with everybody, because people are from all walks of life and all different worlds nowadays.
I think, Philip, I loved that you said authentic and real, because I think in the fact that I was a Native person teaching about Native people made a difference. It was authentic and real, and that does not mean any disrespect towards my non-Indigenous colleagues. We need our allies, trust me, okay? but there is an authentic part to that. And when we talk about identity, and students are reading books like Tommy Orange, They're There, if they're reading that, I could certainly speak how I related and make that comfort level for the other students to do that too. But, you know, I think my advice would be, don't be afraid to be real, to be who you are. And when you role model that, if we can role model that, so Philip and Shaquana can feel that, and other Indigenous and other children, and make it age appropriate, teach the truth, but make it age appropriate. I think that's important. So I appreciate the authentic and real.
Thank you so much.
Agreed.
One thing I'll add is that one thing that's really unfortunate about the way transactionalism, or kind of a capitalist logic, informs what we even think about as learning in classroom spaces, is that, you know, it's oriented toward an objective or an outcome. You put something in, you get something out, we measure and we test it. Right. And even when we try to sort of insert emotion into that, it ends up being about, I don't know, everything has to be a positive experience. And that's really counter to kind of, at least how I understand my own tradition and teachings. There's this notion of kame in Quechua, where like the only kind of productive relationship space of any kind is when tensions are recognized, and that's something you have to reconcile. So it's not like this or that, or good or bad, or positive or negative. It's like that whole relationship in and of itself is a productive space, and you need that to live, to love, to learn, whatever it is. And we make classrooms these really kind of manufactured spaces that keep that all outside. And the other thing I said, if we are teaching authentically about Native peoples, inevitably there's going to be tension, because we aren't just talking about different ways of being in the world, we're talking about competing ways of being in the world. And when we've got a climate clock ticking down of less than 10 years, I think, for an irreversible moment in the temperature of the earth, we have to make some radical shifts, and that's not easy. That's okay, you're okay, you do this, I'll do that. It's a battle, and most.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Oh, I was gonna say, and to add, that was a very important thing with this House and Senate bill, because to us in Mashantucket, it was almost meaningless if they were to pass this bill and didn't ask us, or didn't ask Mohegan, or didn't ask Scattercoke, or didn't ask anybody what they wanted to be taught. Because they've been teaching about us for thousands of years, and obviously it hasn't worked enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this seminar right now. So it is now our turn to tell our story. And that was the real important thing about that bill.
Yes. I wish we could keep talking and talking, and you know, we can, but maybe just not in this space. I am gonna pass it back to you, Dan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And Dallas, do you have just a quick thing you'd want to add to that last question there to close us out? Just last advice.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this isn't so much about kind of the heart work and the kind of intellectual work, but it is about, I see some conversation in the chat about age appropriate materials, and those resources are a great starting place. But the same way that you scaffold an understanding about any concept, you can do that for teaching about and with Native people. And you can introduce that through the amazing resources that are there in children's literature that are written and illustrated by Indigenous authors, many at People Get Ready books, and you can start that with exposure at a very K through 3. In 3rd grade, I saw some great resources that you're studying Connecticut history. You introduce the names of the tribal communities that exist in Connecticut today, and that is more information than most students get throughout their K through 12 and sometimes college careers. But if you give that to 3rd graders, they will hold on to that and they'll build on that. And your middle school teachers can introduce more sophisticated concepts around history and will have kind of an understanding of history. So that by the time students are in high school, they are ready to engage with civics and understanding tribal sovereignty and tribal nations who have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States government. And they can use that as citizens of the world, right? Take that lens of understanding what indigeneity is here in Connecticut, and they can apply it in all colonized spaces. And there are many around the world.
Thank you for closing it out in such a concrete way. We're out of time, unfortunately. Alex, I think a thank you is in order to our panelists.
Yes, I just want to say, Tlazokamati, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your time, your knowledge with us. I know I just learned so much, and I hope that everyone who's here listening is thanking these people behind their screens just for all of the lessons that we leave here, or that we leave with here today. Yeah, just thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining the chat, for all your contributions. Look forward to our ongoing work, and good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.